Welcome to the channel. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more fascinating historical stories like this one. Today, we dive into a gripping chapter of the Vietnam War, where American paratroopers from the 2nd Battalion, 173rd Airborne Brigade, crossed a river in the dense jungle of Benkat, rifles held high to keep them dry. This 12-day mission was part of a larger U.S. operation aimed at seeking out and countering Viet Cong forces. Interestingly, no direct combat occurred during this particular operation, yet its significance remained critical. The mission was part of an ongoing effort to assert control over enemy-dominated areas, continually pressuring the Viet Cong by disrupting their supply lines and communications. At the same time, in the Mekong Delta, about 130 South Vietnamese soldiers faced torrential monsoon rains as they traveled in sampans, small traditional boats, towards a dawn assault on a Viet Cong guerrilla camp just 13 miles from Cano, a pivotal city in the region. The assault resulted in several Viet Cong casualties, striking a blow to their local operations. One of the most dramatic moments of the Vietnam War was the Tet Offensive, when Viet Cong fighters launched a bold surprise attack by breaching the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon, now Ho Chi Minh City. For nearly 6 hours, fierce fighting raged as they briefly controlled part of the compound. Though the attack ended with American forces retaking the embassy and either killing or capturing the invaders, the strike shattered the illusion of U.S. dominance, showing that even highly secured locations were vulnerable. Fast forward to the Cambodian incursion, when President Richard Nixon ordered U.S. forces, including the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment, to cross into Cambodia. The mission aimed to dismantle the Viet Cong's well-established hideouts and tunnel networks used for supply and shelter under Cambodia's neutrality. Over 30,000 American and South Vietnamese troops pushed deep into Cambodian territory in an attempt to destroy these enemy sanctuaries. This bold move, announced by Nixon at the White House, marked a pivotal escalation of the war beyond Vietnam's borders, sparking fierce protests back home. In London, on March 17, 1968, approximately 10,000 demonstrators gathered in front of the U.S. Embassy in Grosvenor Square, demanding an end to U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Tensions between police and protesters ran high, leading to numerous arrests and a display of the growing global opposition to the conflict. Such protests became symbolic of the broader anti-war movement, shaping public opinion and influencing the political landscape. In the U.S., notable figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and Dr. Benjamin Spock, the renowned pediatrician, marched at the forefront of an anti-Vietnam War protest on State Street in Chicago, embodying the national outcry against the prolonged conflict. Each of these events reflects the complexity and far-reaching impact of the Vietnam War, not just on the battlefield, but across societies around the world. Today, we explore significant moments from the Vietnam War era, where voices of protest and intense battles shaped both the battlefield and the home front. One of the most powerful voices against the war was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He denounced the conflict, especially highlighting its harsh impact on African American and impoverished communities. At the same time, coordinated by the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese Army, the Tet Offensive shook the world. Launched during the Lunar New Year holiday, when many expected a ceasefire, it targeted several cities, including Saigon. The offensive brought devastation to entire neighborhoods as rockets and grenades ignited massive fires that destroyed buildings and left countless civilians homeless. While the material destruction was immense, the human toll was even more tragic, with many casualties on both sides. Back in the United States, the war stirred fierce opposition, and one of the most tragic events unfolded at Kent State University. During a protest against the Vietnam conflict, National Guard members opened fire on unarmed students, killing 4 and wounding 9 others. This shocking event sent ripples of outrage across the nation, further intensifying debates over the war and how the government handled growing dissent. Meanwhile, in Vietnam's dense jungles and winding rivers, SEAL Team 1 was on the front lines. These elite Navy operatives carried out daring missions along the Bossac River, navigating treacherous waters to disrupt enemy supply lines. Their operations, which included reconnaissance, ambushes, and direct attacks, played a crucial role in preventing the flow of military supplies that sustained the communist resistance. In the jungle battles near Phuc Vinh, north of Saigon, American soldiers faced the constant threat of hidden Viet Cong snipers. Taking cover in muddy bomb craters left by aerial bombardments, they fought in a landscape scarred by war. These intense battles, filled with ambushes and sudden attacks, were a harsh reminder of the relentless and unpredictable nature of the conflict. On the diplomatic front, in 1967, Under-Secretary of State Nicholas Katzenbach appeared before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, defending the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. He argued that revoking this legislative support, which had allowed President Lyndon Johnson to escalate military operations without a formal declaration of war, would weaken U.S. efforts in Vietnam and send the wrong message to both allies and enemies. General William Westmoreland, the architect of the war's attrition strategy, was known for his efforts to wear down the enemy by inflicting heavy casualties. During a visit to the 1st Battalion, 16th Regiment of the 1st Division near Bien Hoa, he assessed the combat conditions and bolstered troop morale as part of his larger mission to defeat the Viet Cong through relentless pressure. On the home front, the pacifist movement gained momentum as groups like Women's Strike for Peace protested the war. On February 9, 1966, women gathered in front of the White House, carrying symbolic white paper doves and black helium balloons with the message, "Stop the killing." These protests reflected the growing opposition to the war and contributed to increasing pressure on the U.S. government to reduce military involvement. Looking further back, in history, the Red River Delta in northern Vietnam was the scene of intense conflict during the First Indochina War in 1954. Young guerrilla fighters, armed with grenades, stood ready to face the Viet Minh forces battling for independence from French colonial rule. The climactic Battle of Dien Bien Phu marked the end of French control in the region and led to the division of Vietnam into North and South, setting the stage for the larger conflict that would unfold in the decades to come. These stories remind us of the far-reaching impact of the Vietnam War, from the fierce battles on the ground to the protests and movements that shaped the global conversation about the conflict. French paratroopers were deployed to defend the fortress at Dien Bien Phu, but despite their efforts, the strategic advantage of the Viet Minh, led by General Vong Nguyen Giap, and their masterful guerrilla tactics led to a decisive Vietnamese victory. The battle, which raged from March to May 1954, marked a turning point in Vietnam's fight for independence. The French, confident they could control the region and cut off Viet Minh supply lines, established a fortress in a valley surrounded by hills. However, the Viet Minh took up commanding positions in those hills, strategically placing heavy artillery to relentlessly pound the French positions below. The French paratroopers fought valiantly, but the fortress became encircled and isolated, cut off from reinforcements. On May 7, 1954, after enduring months of bombardment and dwindling supplies, the French garrison was forced to surrender. This defeat led to a momentous diplomatic event at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, Switzerland. It was here that the Indochina Truce Agreements were signed, bringing an end to years of intense conflict involving France, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos. This agreement paved the way for the eventual independence of these nations and marked a new chapter in the region's history. Key figures from the Soviet Union, the United States, and other global powers were present, underscoring the conflict's international significance. The man behind the Viet Minh's victory, General Vong Nguyen Giap, solidified his place as one of Vietnam's most skilled military leaders. His innovative and effective strategies throughout the First Indochina War culminated in the historic triumph at Dien Bien Phu, a battle that would become symbolic of the Vietnamese struggle for independence from French colonial rule. Meanwhile, in South Vietnam, on November 13, 1960, President Ngo Dinh Diem made his first public appearance following a failed coup. Standing on the balcony of the presidential palace in Saigon, Diem waved to a crowd, affirming his grip on power despite the attempt to overthrow him. He would rule for 3 more years before his eventual assassination in 1963. Another critical moment in Cold War history unfolded on May 1, 1960, when a U.S. U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers, was shot down over Soviet territory. While not directly related to Vietnam, this incident heightened tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers involved in the conflict. Powers' capture and trial in Moscow deepened the mistrust between the two nations and contributed to the volatile international atmosphere, which influenced U.S. actions in Vietnam. On the battlefields of Vietnam, soldiers like Bob G. Whitworth from the 11th Light Infantry Brigade experienced the grueling demands of combat. A photograph captured Whitworth after he had gone 3 days without sleep, a testament to the intense physical and mental strain soldiers faced. In one operation, where Whitworth was photographed, American forces engaged in a fierce battle that resulted in over 400 enemy deaths, though Allied casualties were minimal by comparison. The toll on the soldiers, however, was evident. Another notable military mission was Operation Oregon, near Duc Pho in Quang Ngai Province, where U.S. forces aimed to neutralize enemy activity in a region known for its strong Viet Cong presence. A striking image from this operation shows an American soldier being carefully lowered into a Viet Cong tunnel, a tactic used to disrupt the complex underground networks the communists relied on for supply routes, hideouts, and command centers. Anti-war sentiment continued to rise back in the United States, and on January 15, 1968, a significant protest led by former Congresswoman Jeanette Rankin took place in Washington, D.C. Rankin, along with prominent figures like Ruth Krauss, Vel Phillips, and Lucy Montgomery, marched with banners and symbols opposing the Vietnam War, gathering in front of the Capitol to demand an end to the conflict. As the war dragged on, key meetings between American and South Vietnamese leaders occurred. On July 19, 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson met with South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu in Honolulu, Hawaii, to discuss ongoing efforts and the path toward peace. This meeting reflected the growing complexity of the war, which had caused widespread devastation in Vietnam and deep divisions in the U.S. Eventually, Nguyen Van Thieu would resign as North Vietnamese forces approached, marking a dramatic shift in the region's history. Amidst the battles, American soldiers also engaged in tactics aimed at weakening the Viet Cong. One striking moment captured in a photograph shows a soldier from the 1st Cavalry Division tossing a basket of rice into flames, part of a strategy to destroy resources and deny them to the enemy. However, this tactic had severe consequences for local civilians. The rice that was burned belonged to a peasant woman, who could only watch in desperation as her livelihood went up in flames. In the midst of the chaos, moments of brief respite occurred. At Fire Base Catherine, south of the demilitarized zone, soldiers of the 3rd Brigade, 101st Airborne Division, held a rock music session in July 1970, a rare moment of relief in the harsh reality of military life. Protests continued back home, with one of the largest demonstrations taking place during the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in 1968. Tens of thousands of people, including students, civil rights activists, and war opponents, gathered to voice their discontent with the ongoing conflict. The convention and protests occurred in a highly charged atmosphere, leading to violent clashes between demonstrators and the police, with the images broadcast nationwide, further intensifying public debate. Press briefings, often referred to as the 500 Follies, became a daily event in Saigon. These meetings, led by American military officials, were intended to update journalists on the war's progress. However, the information provided was frequently criticized for being inaccurate, leading to skepticism from the media and the public alike. In one poignant scene, sunlight filtered through the dense vegetation around the city of Binh Gia, where South Vietnamese troops and their U.S. advisors lay in wait for a Viet Cong attack that never came. The troops, positioned in ambush, spent a tense night in a region known for frequent Viet Cong activity. Amidst these events, efforts toward peace were recognized on the international stage. In 1973, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese diplomat Le Duc, though, were awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for their work in negotiating an agreement to end the Vietnam War, though the conflict would continue for several more years. One of the most symbolic protests against the war took place in December 1971, when Vietnam veterans against the war occupied the Statue of Liberty for 40 hours. These veterans, many of whom had served in the conflict, raised their clenched fists in defiance, expressing their opposition to the ongoing war and U.S. bombings. Finally, the revelation of the Pentagon Papers in 1971, published by the New York Times and exposed by former military analyst Daniel Ellsberg, further fueled the anti-war movement. These secret documents, detailing the government's handling of the conflict, led to a historic Supreme Court case and solidified the public's right to information. From the battlefield to the home front, the Vietnam War left an indelible mark on history, shaping global politics, public opinion, and the lives of countless individuals. This battle was infamous for its sheer brutality and the heavy toll it took on both sides. American forces, facing intense resistance, struggled to capture the heavily fortified hill, known as Hamburger Hill. Though ultimately a victory, it sparked widespread controversy due to the high number of casualties and the questionable strategic value of the hill. General Creighton Abrams, who succeeded General William Westmoreland as head of the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, MACV, in 1968, played a pivotal role. During the war, under his command, the MACV not only coordinated U.S. military efforts, but also implemented a new strategic approach known as Vietnamization. This policy focused on gradually turning over the responsibility for combat operations to South Vietnamese forces, while simultaneously improving local security and gaining civilian support. The human cost of the conflict was particularly evident during battles near Saigon, where women and children often found themselves in dire circumstances, seeking refuge in trenches, basements, or ruined buildings to escape the crossfire. In New York, peace demonstrators gathered in Central Park, protesting the war by burning their draft cards. Using a coffee can filled with sand and soaked in lighter fluid, they set the cards alight in a powerful act of defiance. Though illegal and carrying the risk of imprisonment, this gesture symbolized their vehement opposition to the war, which they viewed as unjust and unnecessary. In the political arena, one of the most critical moments came during the secret negotiations between U.S. presidential advisor Dr. Henry Kissinger and North Vietnamese negotiator Lưu Duc Tho. These discussions culminated in the signing of the Paris Peace Accords in January 1973, marking the withdrawal of American troops and the beginning of the end of the conflict. The complex talks addressed ceasefires, prisoner exchanges, and Vietnam's political future, laying the groundwork for peace. As the conflict drew to a close, the final desperate evacuation of Saigon unfolded. American sailors aboard the USS Blue Ridge played a key role in Operation Frequent Wind, pushing helicopters into the sea to make room for more evacuees as they fled the city, which was on the brink of being captured by communist forces. This chaotic evacuation culminated in the fall of Saigon, as American helicopters rushed to rescue citizens and Vietnamese allies from the U.S. Embassy's rooftop. It became the largest helicopter evacuation in history, a desperate scramble as crowds of Vietnamese civilians, fearing retribution under the new regime, scaled the embassy walls in hopes of escape. On April 30, 1975, a North Vietnamese tank famously crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, symbolizing the end of the war and the reunification of Vietnam under communist control. The image of that tank crossing the palace gates is remembered around the world, representing not only the end of a long and bloody conflict, but also the profound scars it left on the nation and the world. Just before this, the provincial capital of Siem Loc, 35 miles north of Saigon, witnessed a fierce final stand. South Vietnamese General Le Minh Dao faced overwhelming North Vietnamese forces, and despite calls for reinforcements, the swift and complete siege of Siem Loc caught many by surprise. The fall of the city foreshadowed the imminent capture of Saigon and the ultimate defeat of the South Vietnamese government. Throughout the war, helicopters played a crucial role in the American military strategy, allowing for the rapid transport of troops, the evacuation of wounded soldiers, and the capture of Viet Cong prisoners during search and destroy missions. In one iconic image, an American soldier's helmet bore the words "War is hell," capturing the widespread disillusionment felt by many. The Vietnam War claimed millions of lives, both combatant and civilian, and left physical and emotional scars that endured for generations. On the battlefield, Medics like Thomas Cole from Richmond, Virginia, risked their lives to save their comrades. Cole was photographed treating Sergeant Harrison Pell after he was wounded during a firefight with combined North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in Binh Dinh province, a region notorious for intense military activity and frequent clashes. The difficult terrain and well-entrenched enemy forces made operations there particularly dangerous. One of the most harrowing battles took place at Dong Apb during the 10-day struggle for Hamburger Hill. In a dramatic image, two medics helped a wounded paratrooper from the 101st Airborne Division through a blinding storm. The battle, fought on Hill 937, was a fierce confrontation between American and South Vietnamese forces and North Vietnamese communist troops. The hill's name became a grim metaphor for the battle's carnage, as soldiers compared it to a meat grinder. The battle was notorious for the fierce resistance mounted by communist defenders, resulting in substantial casualties on both sides. American Marines, advancing up a hill in what was thought to be a secure area, faced grueling conditions while carrying heavy equipment, including vital water containers. In the hot, humid climate of Vietnam, water was essential for survival, alongside weapons, ammunition, and other gear necessary for combat. The difficult terrain made the advance exhausting, but the ability to carry supplies ensured that the troops maintained their fighting strength. One of the fiercest battles of the war occurred on Hill 742, located near Dac-2, 5 miles northwest of the soldiers' position. The steep, densely forested terrain favored the guerrilla tactics of the communist forces, making this engagement particularly brutal. American troops faced relentless artillery fire, ambushes, and booby traps in what would become one of the most grueling conflicts of the war. Amidst this violence, rare moments of humanity emerged. In Hue, an American paramedic was photographed carrying a wounded child away from the battle. The child had been found wandering between North Vietnamese and American firing lines, and the medic, risking his own safety, ensured she received the care she needed. This act of kindness amidst the chaos highlighted the enduring dignity of humanity, even in the midst of war. During the Vietnam War, U.S. Secretary of Defense Melvin R. Laird visited South Vietnam, accompanied by General Creighton W. Abrams, commander of U.S. forces, and American ambassador Ellsworth Bunker. Laird commented on the ongoing communist offensives, noting the deliberate increase in conflict intensity despite a temporary pause in rocket attacks on Saigon. He emphasized that this lull did not signify a reduction in fighting, but a shift in enemy tactics. The visit underscored the complexities of the conflict and the need for coordinated military and diplomatic strategies. In another scene, Marines were photographed atop an M48 Patton tank during an operation southwest of Phu Bai. As the tank's 90mm cannon fired, the Marines covered their ears against the deafening blast. The M48 Patton was a key asset in the U.S. military's armored forces, providing heavy firepower and protection during combat operations, including missions aimed at sweeping roads for ambushes and improvised explosive devices, IEDs, planted by the Viet Cong. In Wakefield, Massachusetts, a pro-war demonstration took place, organized by 19-year-old student Paul P. Christopher. Troubled by the frequent anti-war protests, Christopher and other demonstrators believed U.S. involvement in Vietnam was essential to counter the spread of communism and protect freedom in Southeast Asia. The event emphasized the need to support the American troops fighting in Vietnam, many of whom, like Christopher, were young and faced the harsh realities of war. Meanwhile, in a controversial and shocking event during the Tet Offensive, South Vietnamese General Nguyen Ngoc Loan executes Viet Cong guerrilla Nguyen Van Lem in Saigon on February 1, 1968. Captured on camera, this moment became a powerful and disturbing symbol of the Vietnam War's brutality. The public execution, carried out in broad daylight, sent shockwaves around the world, intensifying global criticism of the war and fueling anti-war sentiment in the United States. In 1964, a photograph captured the destruction of a Viet Cong hideout by American and South Vietnamese soldiers. These underground bases, vital to the Viet Cong's guerrilla operations, were often hidden in the dense jungle. Destroying these hideouts was a key objective for Allied forces as they sought to weaken the enemy's infrastructure and disrupt their asymmetric warfare tactics. A vivid image from 1965 shows American soldiers of the 7th Marine Regiment marching along a dirt road in Cape Batangan, Vietnam. Beside them, tanks rumbled by, symbolizing the heavy military presence and mechanized support that characterized U.S. ground operations during the escalating war. The scene reflects the constant movement of troops, as they were mobilized for one operation after another in the increasingly intense conflict.